Hey, everybody, we got a great episode of Cerebrivore lined up for you here. But before we get started, I think I want to draw attention to something that's very important that's kind of going on under the radar. I don't like to talk about politics too much in my podcasting, but I think this is just very important for everybody to know about. Apparently, they are proposing a rule that a compiled, da- a, co- a com- compiled database of all phone numbers where they could just send out information, just blast it out whenever the administration feels like it's something that they want you to hear. Your phone will just, you know, start ringing and you answer it and record a message from the government. Yeah, they're referring that as the one rule to ring them all. Huh? 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 Yeah, forget it.
Most unlikely of villains, schools of brain and for pause. Does he talk? Does he know how? Does he bark or does he meow? Let on the cerebral bore. Heaven show him so much more. Release your brains at the
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Cerebrivore, the sporadic podcast, to quote our friend Joe Richter, where we talk about role playing games.
And other things.
I have and other things, but mostly role playing games because that's what nerds do.
Right.
Right. Um, I'm joined as usual by Carl Rodriguez and Arlen Walker. How you guys doing?
Good. I wave, but you can't see it.
Yep. I keep nodding along, but
Yeah.
you guys can't see that either. So,
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. So, well, we're kind of doing a little bit of an on the fly discussion tonight about optional rules that we like. That we you can either that my thought was rules that I kind of pull in to different games. When I play different kinds of games, but more generally like house rules or rules that you like that you pull from other games or that you've seen in a magazine or a blog post or a video somewhere. So that's what we're gonna talk about for a little bit.
Yeah.
So, and they before we started recording, I was told to just get the ball rolling. So
Yeah.
because I've been thinking for a while about kind of a list of rules that I really like that I tend to want to pull into other places in some form or another, whether it's directly or maybe having to adapt it for whatever the dice or the mechanic is of the game I'm playing. But the first one that came up was using advantage and disadvantage instead of trying to, you know, get a estimate a number. And I know it was can't remember what the first game was that ever used advantage or disadvantage. I know it's been most popularized by fifth edition D&D, although I think in some of the late 4E mechanics they had kind of introduced a version of that if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah. I don't know.
It's
funny.
that simply is.
Yep. Go ahead. I thought you were done.
Good.
Well,
I'm just gonna say. Go ahead, Carl.
No, wherever it started, and because it's been popularized by D&D, it seems like a lot of game systems have a similar mechanic now, right? So I can think of at least two, maybe three games that are not D&D fantasy that do that. So I'll probably add on, or if you don't mention them, then I'll mention those. But go ahead. That was all I was going to say.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, 5E, obviously we think of it whenever you can get it on any kind of place where you're rolling a 20-sided die. You roll two. If you got advantage, take the better result. If you got disadvantage, take the lesser result. And it just keeps you from having to estimate, should this be a +3, a +5, a -1, a -2? It's just, if the situation creates an advantage or disadvantage, there you go. And it's that mechanic itself is kind of present, I think, in even some of the kind of what we would call new SR or indie games that still use a D20 as a mechanic, like Knave is the one I can think of in particular. But I've also seen other games use it for other dice, like damage dice, like in Black Sword Hack. If you're wielding a two-handed weapon, all weapons do a d6, but if you're wielding a two-handed weapon, you roll with advantage, so you roll a d6 twice and take the higher result. So you can apply it in a lot of different contexts.
Yeah.
And I know, like with index card RPG, Hankerin or Rune, I can't. He changes his alias like every year or two. He does not like that mechanic, but he said he has roll easy and roll hard, which is just +3 or -3. So it's not quite statistically the same effect as an advantage or disadvantage, but it's kind of in the ballpark. But again, it's a rule of thumb that makes it easier to just apply it and then move on and keep the game going.
That's cool. Well, interestingly, I did ask Google where the origin of advantage, disadvantage, and it appeared early on in D&D Next, like as a playtest rule. But really, a lot of people argue that the core idea can be traced back to like 1992 and the game Over the Edge, which I have. I wish I had. I have it somewhere on my shelf, but it's probably in the second. It's behind other books, But that's kind of interesting. So right, so where did it come from? Let me see. I was looking in here. Oh, Tunnels and Trolls had something interesting like that too. But anyway, but that's kind of cool. So 1992, Over the Edge, Jonathan Tweet and Robin's Law game. Character mechanics. Let's see what it say. What's your main stat? And you have 2 secondary characteristics, and you undertake an action, and then you add them up. But the referee can decide if circumstances are favorable or not. If they are, then you can add a bonus dice and then drop the worst. That's kind of the disadvantage there from Over the Edge. But it's like a dice pool, so it's not like a D20 type of thing. And some would say that even Tunnels and Trolls back in 75 had, if you got doubles, you could re-roll, right? So,
Well,
it's definitely
think about it. When 46 dropped the lowest for ability scores is almost rolling your score with this, kind of giving you
an advantage
into that concept.
Yeah,
of advantage. In fact, I could even see a game, and there may be one that does this, that says, if you've got a species or an archetype that is bad at something, I swear I've seen this somewhere recently. I plays, you roll this 46 and drop the highest, because that's what this particular character type is not good at.
Right. Well,
you can still technically be at a decent score, but it.
Yeah, I know for the Hero's Journey, maybe for first edition, but definitely for second edition, I'm more familiar with by James Spann. I don't know how you say it. In that game, all of the different lineages for heroic basically races in old school D&D or ancestries or whatever you want to call them, the way that it works is it's sort of like 3d6 down the line, except that in the case of lineages that have something that they're good at and bad at, that for good scores it'll be 2d6 plus 6, and for bad scores it'll be 2d6 plus 1. So you have essentially a much easier to get a really high score with the 2d6 plus 6, which is kind of right. It's not totally the same as rolling more dice and getting rid of, but it's, I think, an interesting kind of similar, right? Conceptually, it's similar to just like, well, set one of those dice to a 1 or set one of those dice to a 6 and then roll the other ones.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I guess that is kind of, with that 2d6 plus 6, you are.
And now that I'm thinking about it.
Oh.
Now that you're thinking about it.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
One of the now that I'm thinking about it, what I was thinking about 4E, and it was an advantage disadvantage. They introduced some mechanics where it was, whenever you roll a D20, anything less than a 9 counts as a 10. So it's not advantage or disadvantage, but it is sort of a, you can't score lower than a 10 on a D20 die.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I guess
Yeah,
inherently, when you do that, I guess it gives you a +5, right? Is that's the average, Harlan? I think, right?
Yeah.
With how the math works out.
yeah. Advantage, disadvantage on a D20 is sort of roughly equivalent to plus minus five, although it's not quite the same because the thing is that depending on what number you need, basically it's a slightly different calculation,
Hmm.
basically advantage, disadvantage versus plus five, right? Because you can see conceptually, right, that plus five, if all you need is a four, is an automatic, all you need is a six even is an automatic success, whereas advantage where you need a six or higher is not quite automatic, but it is pretty close,
Hmm.
so you know.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
probably the
It,
bonus expands the lower the target number probably for
Yeah,
advantage,
I think
and
the
and it and it limits your upper limit too. So like
yeah,
you could never roll higher than well, barring an ability score modifier or something else, you can still never roll higher than 20. You can just
yeah,
increase the odds that you're going to get a 20.
Mhm.
yeah.
That's interesting. So
Yeah, that's in fact
So
a
you can still it's sort of yeah. Go ahead.
okay, well there's a
Carl.
system that I've looked at a couple times that's pretty cool. That's Codex Martialis that's basically built on third edition in a lot of ways and it has all these other different things. But that's basically the way that they handle a lot of combat is that you have a pool of D20s to use and you choose how many to use and you kind of like advantage, but you can use up to like all four of them on one attack and you just use the highest score. Um, but then that ties into like how crits work and stuff that you can imagine that if you have like rolling three d20s, it's a lot easier to fish for a 20 for a crit than if you just do one at a time, things like that. So
Yeah.
it's kind of an interesting, um, you know, push your resources into different places type thing.
Yes, I think other games have
Yeah.
taken
That
this
sounds kind of
advantage.
like the Modifius stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And other games I think have taken this advantage, disadvantage, and not necessarily D20, but for example, Traveler, you get a boon or a bane. And then
Hmm.
Call of Cthulhu, the other one I can think of off the top of my head, where you get a bonus dice or penalty dice depending on like a favorable, unfavorable circumstance, right? Even One Ring, right? Favored and ill favored,
Yep,
right?
one ring, yeah, favored and ill favored for
Where you
your
roll a
feet die.
yeah roll
Yeah,
the feat dice a D12 dice that has the Eye of Mordor and the Gandalf symbol on it. And if it's favored, well, there's a better chance you're going to get an auto success with the Gandalf symbol. Likewise, if you're ill favored, more of a chance you might get an automatic failure with the Eye of Mordor.
which is
So
why there's really
Well,
only
it's
like oh BJ, you go first.
oh, go ahead. Finish.
Okay.
I had a different thought
Well, I was
on
just
the One Ring.
it's for the One Ring. It's part of why in second edition it's there's almost well there's only a couple of very specific ways to get a weapon skill favored, um, because the feat die result is what determines your piercing blow effect, and so having a favored weapon skill is really powerful because you get crits all the time essentially by
mhm,
comparison to normal.
yeah. Mm.
Mm.
But it's basically like
I,
only a
I was just going
handful
to
of
say that
special
the
cultural virtues.
yep. Yeah. I was going to say it's crept into my old school essentials games where not just on the D20, but like when we're using the D6 mechanic to adjudicate like exploration or other
Mm.
kinds of things. If this situation is particularly favorable or disfavorable, and the players all just know. I don't even have to tell. We're going to do a D6. I just said, somebody rolled a D6, and I was like, do that with advantage or disadvantage, and they knew instantly how to apply that. So it was very smooth.
Yeah.
Another place that I've seen it in Black Sword Hack, if you listen to some of the solo play I've been doing, the Oracle, when it's a yes or no, generally 1 to 3 is no, and or and 4 to 6 is a yes. But it even says if the situation seems more to your favor or less to your favor, roll twice, and take the better or worse result.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you use that oracle in your Morkborg, or Merc Mori. I'll try to pronounce it in the correct weird Swedish way. Um, you use that in your solo because I remember you rolling and go, "Oh, this is a bad situation," so I'm gonna, yay, take the lowest or take, whatever. So that's interesting. I might have
Yeah.
to try to let it creep in to, like, let's say, I just thought of this. Like in Hyperborea, how we're using feats, like a feats of intelligence, sort of feats of intelligence, wisdom. Oh, that's another. Maybe we'll save
Mhm.
that for a second. But feats of intelligence and wisdom to determine magic items, right? Maybe I should say, okay, one of you roll, but if people are helping, you roll with an advantage. It make it a lot easier than all of a sudden 4 or 5 different rolls pop, 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 pop coming out. I think that might be a way to do it. If someone's aiding, so like if someone's aiding you, then you get an advantage, right? Um, on that, something like that. Or if it's obscure,
Yeah.
um, usually, I mean, with a D6, usually I have a plus or minus in mind, but maybe if it's very obscure, then well, with disadvantage or something like that, or if it's a very unique or very rare item, type of thing. So it could be interesting to use. But I
Yeah.
probably won't call
I
it
think
advantage,
those help because
disadvantage.
when those roles, you know, I think that's helpful when the result is sort of a static target based on the character. Like your ability score on chances in six are, and it's kind of immutable. But instead of trying or a bonus on the item or the circumstance, that just sort of again kind of you know I don't have to hit a different target number. I've just got to roll more than one die and see if I can get one to work for me.
Yeah, that's cool. All right. So I guess we kind of just hinted at it. Another rule I use, is that sort of feet dice. Is that what they call them in Hyperborea? And I was kind of using this the other day in like AD&D to adjudicate whether someone could do X, but it's not necessarily written. Can you do this? So like, climbing. So then those
Mhm.
feats of is it feat or test? I can't remember.
Mhm.
It's a test of, right?
Is both. Yeah, there's test, which is the
They have both.
D6s, and then
The,
Yeah.
the,
feat,
the,
that's the
yeah.
D100.
Yeah. So test is a D6. So I'm using like a test of, like, let's say uh an elf wants to climb down a ravine. They have a really good dex, roll a D6, right? Because they're not an elf thief, so you're not going to roll the percentile dice for climbing, right? And if it's a favorable situation, like there's a lot of handholds, well, maybe they get a bonus or not, or they can only fall on a 5 or a 6 or something. But yeah, I think it's a great way to do it, and then to also, so you don't have to go, oh man, they're not a thief, so I guess they're going to fall because no one else has ever climbed a wall except for a thief. But so I think those are really good ways to kind of use your ability scores when you don't have a skill system, especially to do something that an adventurer or hero might find themselves doing, like a physical thing, and even a mental thing, right? Like there's no, like the identify spell. I think a lot of people will agree early incarnations are pretty harsh. So it's just, I mean, it's just more fun, I think, in gameplay too, to let the spellcasters try to look through the thing, think about their history and their traditions, and just roll their intelligence or wisdom, whatever, to see if they remember or can hold the item and manipulate it such that they can read the runes or understand what it's doing. I think it's more interesting and exciting. It pushes the game forward. Um, and it's not always a success, which is even more interesting. I know that there's one item that kind of uh, was very obscure for a long time among the group, and they finally go, "Oh, we finally figured out what this was." That's kind of cool. I think that's a really neat use of that. Just a simple D6 mechanic, and then you could even go to the next step, which is a feat, like it's the old Ben Bar's lift gates thing that they had for strength, and then a feat of strength dex con, um, to do something more extraordinary, like break down a barred door or lift a portcullis, right? So, or like in Conan the Barbarian, tip over a boiling vat of people parts. right? So
Or punch a camel and knock it out.
yeah, I think it's a cool little mechanic that I think I've implemented, maybe like even subconsciously, you know, in games.
You know, Arlen, do you have any one off the top of your head that's a good go-to mechanic or?
I don't know, not a whole lot that I've used in a whole bunch of different places, but there's definitely some like kind of like a mechanic that I've seen in an OSR game and been like, oh, well, I'm just going to use that in a bunch of other OSR games. Like I mentioned how ability scores are rolled in the hero's journey, but one of the other things that that game does that I think is cool is that when your character levels up, you get points that can be used in a bunch of different ways that are kind of your heroic stature growing basically. And so one of the things you can do is essentially enchant to items or discover enchants, if that is how it works, that you can kind of, like add a special feature to your favorite sword, that sort of thing, instead of just, tossing out whichever's the magic sword that has the biggest plus bonus when you get to it, that sort of thing. But also one of the cool things that they do in that one, it's one of the optional rules that basically if your character doesn't technically qualify for some of the like specialist class features for your class, um, so like the swordsman class has a special thing that like if your dexterity is high enough, you can have like an offhand dagger and fight two weapon fighting and use your dagger basically the equivalent of a shield, but only if your dexterity is good enough to like be able to handle that. And so it's kind of a reason to go into that class, but a lot of those requirements are really high. And I really like this rule of like one of the things you can use your points on basically is just to ignore the requirements for some of those specialist things. And I like that for a lot of like old school games that have kind of like weird and interesting features that the character might not make use of very often, or um, might not even necessarily have access to. In that game, it's really easy because it's like, oh yeah, you have these like specific explicit features. But I like that also as a thing of like basically giving the character classes that don't get to choose spells something else to
Hmm.
decide when they level up, because in old school games so much of like the martial classes really don't, in a lot of old school games, don't get a lot of like things to do when they level up other than, oh, I've got more hit points and I hit a little more often. So I always think that's fun.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
I have another one.
there's a well, okay. Well, I was going to say, and it kind of fits in conceptually with what both of you guys are discussing, both the D6 kind of feats of whatever, and then what Arlen was talking about is using in old school games, if you're going to use a skill, or sometimes there's some implied skills like opening stuck doors, or finding uh, pitfalls, secret
Mhm.
doors, things like that, is to use that D6 mechanic, but to even use like that for the thief skills instead of the percentile. But there's an optional rule that Gavin Norman created for old school essentials, where the basically for the thief they get so many points per level to spread across those, and they're instead of those they want to specialize in, which I think AD&D, can't remember first edition did. I know second edition did. You got to pick where put your every time you level thief. Um, but I kind of like that. Even for like if you're using the advanced rules where you've got rangers and assassins and other people who have skills, you can. It's pretty easy to make all those a D6 skill, and just anybody has a 1 to 6 chance of doing most of these things, but you get an enhanced. Your chances go up based on your level or your class. Um, but
Yes, I think it's a
so,
really good way
Carl,
to expand that.
what were you about to?
The reaction rule. the
Gotcha.
ubiquitous reaction, like the 2d6 reaction roll, low on the low end is going to be hostile or or upset at you. The middle is neutral, and the top end is favorable. A bonus for any charisma modifier or situational modifier, like if the player talks a good game or says something that could insult the person he's talking to, or even when a creature, I feel like it's not always doesn't always have to be the case that when you have an encounter, like even especially like an animal encounter, most animals are gonna run away from you or ignore you or just kind of look at you with curiosity. So I think that's a great way to adjudicate whether the animal is going to attack, and then you can say, "Oh, they're hungry," or you're in their territory or whatever, or um, or they see you as a threat, or they just kind of ignore you and keep on grazing or moving on or what hunting or whatever. So I think the 2d12 reaction roll is really good. And I mean, like AD&D has a percentile dice, which is kind of the same thing. Low percentage is something bad's going to happen. High percentage is something good's going to happen. Neutral, and in the middle is neutral. So I guess it's a bit more granular, but it's essentially the same as a 2d6. And sometimes it's just easier. And since I've memorized that table, to just roll the 2d6, and give a bonus or not, as it were.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty cool. I mean, I use that quite a bit.
Yeah. I think that's a good the way he's playing in your games, seeing you use it. That's good. And of course, I think it's imperative for a game master that uses that mechanic to understand context. That a hostile predator is different than a hostile herd animal, and a hostile animal is different than a hostile shopkeeper in their shop when you've just come in to buy supplies, right?
Yeah.
That you have to interpret what is hostile based on the context. But that increases the utility of it because now it's not just something to use when you bump into a monster in the wild. It
Right.
actually
Oh
is
yeah, yeah.
useful for when you're like, what's their original disposition, and can you change it through your role playing or through skill use or through magic or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and at least it's some fun encounters. Like in recent AD&D game, I used the percentile or 2d6 reaction roll mechanic, and I had idea what was going on in the tavern the player characters go into, and I rolled sort of a negative result, and I just adjudicated that these thoroughly miners who've just gotten off of work and worked really hard, and for whatever reason, when one of the characters brings in their guard dog, they don't like the guard dog and they start throwing stuff at it. So the player like left, and I rolled again, and then it became like hostile. So then a couple of those miners came out, and it led to a fun little altercation. So it just can lead to really fun emergent play and scenes in a game. I think it's a nice way to just make encounters a little different, and then not right. You never. I feel like as I GM more and more, I think you just want things to happen as they happen, not really have a plan in mind. Let the players come up with an idea, and let's roll the dice at some point to see how it goes. And I think not having like we're not going to have a bar fight, like, but let's see what you know. You don't have a pre-planned encounter. I guess that's the thing, and I think that's what the beauty of the encounter, the reaction roll is, because you don't have a pre-planned encounter. It just happens. It's rolled randomly. You roll your 2d6 or percentile dice, and then the spider walks away. The the bear kind of growls, and if the player characters don't do anything, it moves away, right? So you can it always doesn't have to be. I mean, now it can be a hostile encounter, like if you're in some enemy territory and you roll it and you know that they're going to be hostile. I mean, unless the players think on their feet very quickly, or surprise them and go,
Yeah.
"Hey, how's it going? Well, I was lost." I mean, you can also. I mean, depends what the players do, but I think that the reaction roll makes it such that you don't have like the quantum ogre. I think, in your game.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And in Hyperborea, I know it's led to some fun encounters.
Arlen, you got any other? Uh, certainly. Yes. Arlen, do you have any other favorite? Even if it's not one it's easily pulled in. Any just kind of specific rules you just really enjoy the way they work.
Um, I don't know. I think well, I was thinking about there's some like things that I think have become really common in kind of running games and adjudicating games, but that I can remember seeing them as a rule the first time. So like in I remember the first time I encountered like explicitly the concept of when you try to do something that's your attempt to do it and you can't just like continue to roll attempts to do it unless the situation changes or there's something else going on was in Burning Wheel that that game specifically says like it's a rule that if you roll to pick a lock and you fail you can't just keep rolling to lockpick unless there is like something else happening basically. And I think that's become like pretty standard for the way that certainly a lot of the games that I play in have that kind of concept, right? Is that you can't, right? Like if the guard isn't going to come around the corner, we're not just going to sit there and have you roll lockpick 8 times until you get it right. Um, and then there's a sort of version of that with like the other side of like a take 20 rule in some games, things like that.
Mhm.
But I remember thinking, well, that's like a really good way to handle a lot of the kind of sort of emergent consequences of failure of games because I feel like there are games that I've definitely played in where you're trying to pick the lock and it seems like the obvious way forward and the dice aren't agreeing and it's sort of like, well, there's not really any consequence either way. And I think the answer to that is, well, if there's no consequence for taking forever to pick the lock, then don't bother rolling. You just say, well, eventually it happens. Um, but I remember liking that as a concept of like this is your time to do something, and if you fail at it, that doesn't necessarily mean that your character is incapable, right? It could be you tried to pick a lock and the lock turns out the lock was more complicated than we all thought, or try to jump a chasm and you don't quite make it, things like that. That's not not necessarily that there's ways to sort of retcon the fiction to say like, oh, actually your character's still capable, you just can't do this way. But I like the idea of like, you put together your attempt to do the thing and then basically the failure stands as a concept and failure and success stands, right? So like if you jump across a chasm when you're coming back through the dungeon, you don't have to roll again. We already know you can jump across the chasm. You already did it one time. It's fine. Now you're getting chased out of the dungeon, right? If there's a dragon behind you and circumstances are a little different, you might have to roll again. But I really like that as a way to be like, no, we roll the dice to figure out what happens in these situations and we don't just roll until we get like the result that we want basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of like that
Yeah.
concept where you just kind of
What is sorry.
Yep.
I would say a related one I like to that is that failure is not failure; it's success with a consequence. So, like with the block picking example, um, okay, the thief didn't fail to pick the lock, but we're going to roll for a random encounter because it's taking you a long time, and you're not doing it as quietly as you would, or whatever's on the other side of that door. There's no chance of surprising them now. They heard the handle jiggling and the scraping at the lock, and you've lost that opportunity. So in that way you're never the the two things that sort of kill momentum. I can't pick a lock and something essential is behind that door, or I can't pass a perception or skill check at the next a skill roll or some kind of check is the we were all bottlenecked at this and the adventure can't go forward unless I have this piece of information or I open this door or I you know so that's a good way of doing it. Is yeah, it's you can't just keep
Yeah,
trying it,
there's
but there's not just binary outcomes.
Yeah, and there's a game, Sword and Scoundrel, that I ran for a little while. That's a lot of fun, really, really well made game. Where they specifically talk about that idea in the fiction, where they basically say the characters are capable. They will succeed at things if there's no pressure, basically, right? Like a character who knows how to lockpick will eventually be able to pick whatever lock they set their mind to because they're capable characters, and when there's no pressure, that's not a problem. When and specifically to use the concept of lockpicking, says when you roll for lockpicking the door, what you're rolling for is not can you get through the door, it's can you get through the door without any other consequences, and really embraces that idea of like, well, if you fail your lockpicking roll, door opens and the guard comes around the corner. Or if you fail, if you fail a fast talk roll, it doesn't necessarily mean you haven't convinced them. It's that the other character has something that they want from you also, right? That it's, your success at rolling is about basically avoiding the potential consequences of the thing that you're trying to do. Or right, like if you fail a perception check, it's not just perception in that game, but basically conceptually, if you fail a check to like find a clue, what that means is not that you don't find the clue, it's that you don't find the clue in time to be able to do the things with it that you might want to do. um, right, things like that. So you have a very, very
Yeah,
deliberate, like, characters are heroic and they fail forward, but if they fail, they're going to have, things that they have to deal with that they weren't didn't want to deal with otherwise. And I remember thinking, oh, it's a really good way for that specific type of, like, Three Musketeers-y pulp type, your big swashbuckling heroes, and you also get into all sorts of trouble as you go around being very, very capable heroes who also don't get what they want all the time.
yeah.
Yep. Cool.
Carl, I cut you off like a couple of minutes ago. So, do you remember
I
what you were going to say?
I don't. Oh yeah, it was kind of like right. I think you should. I don't know. Maybe that's just a strong word. I like that idea that Arlen put forward. That when you're adjudicating as a GM, you just come to like one decision point and then have them make the roll instead of like I've seen early adventures in a variety of games where they're like actually, and it's not even early. There's even some recent like relatively recent Pendragon uh, Pathfinder adventures where like you're going across this netting and and it says, oh, you gotta roll 5 times until you're I mean and inevitably you're gonna fail, right? It's like inevitably you're gonna fail the stealth roll, right? So what's the point of that? Just roll once for that particular instance and not make it incremental. I think that's a good suggestion there by Arlen is, don't make the poor knight try to sneak in armor, and make him roll 5 times to get a backstab on or to get a surprise attack or a quick charge on the giant. Just roll once because the player is going to be very ecstatic if with all the minuses they succeed, and they're like, oh, you got to roll again. Then they're not going to succeed. There's no way they're going to succeed like
You know,
5 times, right? So I think just
Yeah, well, and I think
that makes me. I've read. I think I've read somewhere. I can't remember exactly what it was. Something like if the
oh
happens again.
us
well,
don't even make them roll competent at.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. There's like so that's another good one then. So like Delta Green has this cool rule, and I always forget to use it. I should especially use it like in Call of Cthulhu, especially in the pulp when we do pulp Call of Cthulhu. If you have a skill of 50 or I think 50 or 60 or more, don't even you just get the clue, especially the clue,
mhm.
right? Because that's the deal breaker, right? In Delta Green or in Call of Cthulhu, right? is that when you don't find the clue,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
adventure stops. But if you have a high
Mystery
score,
grinds to a halt, sort of thing. Yeah.
yeah. So now, of course, BJ and Arlen are going to respect their characters to have over 60% in spot hidden. But
Only 60 and no more. Yeah.
but uh but yeah, I think it's a cool it's a cool little
Yeah.
thing that Delta Green has, you know. Obviously in combat it doesn't apply, but you know, for like information gathering type of situations, right? You know,
Mhm.
then
Well,
it's
I
Yeah.
like the ubiquity system has a similar concept. That's a system where your ranking is your basically your number of D2s. You use coins or dice or however you want to do it. Um, but if you have like a score of 8 in something, your average success is 4 successes out of those 8. And one of the rules they have is that you can always just take half, right? If all you need is half to do the thing, you can take it automatically. You don't even bother rolling, right? So if you need 3 successes to shoot somebody and you've got 6 in the score, you just say I shoot them, and I really like that as like for that specific type of like pulpy game where you have those high powered characters who are like consistently capable. I think that works really well as a like yeah, if you put your points into this sort of thing, because it's so annoying when you play a game where you're like building a capable character and you put your points into the one thing, and especially I mean with shooting it doesn't happen as much, but especially like if you have like a computer's hacker character who rolls their computer's skill once a session and you put a bunch of points into it and then you fail, it's so frustrating. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I've used a version, and it's been a while since I've ran a lot of like 5e, but I'd gotten to where I did this in 5e, and I think I'm doing it in our Tales of the Valiant game. Um, is like I try to be mindful of the knowledge skills that all the players have, and instead of say, hey, everybody roll a history check, I look and see who has the highest history skill, and I say, hey, your character would know this, you know, based on
Mhm.
their education in history,
Mm.
or you know, instead of the stupid scenario where the barbarian manages to ace a arcana check and the wizard can't figure out how to read a rune, I just say, yeah, the wizard has the highest arcana. The wizard understands that this rune means the following.
Mhm.
And I kind of picked that up more from it really was inspired to do that by the idea from Gumshoe. You know, the Gumshoe, I can't, I'm drawing a blank on the guy who created Gumshoe. You know, his criticism of Call of Cthulhu was how much stuff you gets missed because of failed spot hidden and library use rolls. When it's like if you're trying to solve a mystery, you should put the clues out there, and if they pass in front of the clue, they just get it right. And it kind of made me think the same thing as well. Why don't you just, you know, if they've got a high enough skill in that, but speaking to that niche protection of, you know, why should, you know, if we're talking about spiritual matters, you know, a cleric should probably be the one who just would know this, whereas other people might have to roll for it to see if they could.
Yeah.
Because it's the same thing. Somebody puts all their points into skills, and then you know they don't get to use them because the dice don't work with them, or you've got kind of the which I think is kind of poor. Everybody's Arcana candidate and just everybody
Just start rolling, yeah.
Yeah.
make a stealth check. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I liked there's a
All right. Any
somebody did
other? Oh, good.
oh somebody did an edit of the Pathfinder P6 rules concept that did something kind of similar and clever that I liked, where they divided up the skill list into adventuring skills and non-adventuring skills. And so the idea is that the adventuring skills you get as part of like your class stuff, right? So like each class has specific class skills and you get your skill points based on which class you are, plus your intelligence, all that sort of stuff. But the non-adventuring skills, you just like pick the one that is the thing that you do when you're not adventuring, and there are only like 6 of them. Um, but basically, part of the idea was there's all of these skills that are almost never actually used in adventuring, and they make sense for certain character types to like know those things, but a lot of those character types are really skill point starved in a lot of other ways. So the example that was used was religion for clerics, that basically like, yeah, it makes sense that a cleric knows religion. How many times do you actually roll religion in a game, and how many times do you do it for anything that isn't just, you know, an obscure bit of lore that isn't necessarily necessary for the actual adventure? Why not just have religion and like animal handling and a couple of others? I don't remember all the specific skills, but basically the idea of all of the skills that you don't use very much in adventuring but are useful for just people in the world. You just pick which one, and that's your character learns how to do that with each level as part of their downtime stuff. And I really liked that idea of a way to differentiate, because I think that's a classic problem that I see in game design, right? Is that if useful things and not useful things cost the same amount to like move towards, right? Like the example in Call of Cthulhu, right? That spot hidden and library use cost the same points cost when you're building your character as all of the other skills,
Yeah.
and both of those are going to get used a lot more than all the other skills. So it basically, like all of the flavorful stuff that is not spot hidden in library use, it's like, well, I want my character to be able to do those things because that fits. But if I'm only going to roll, you know, like boating once every 3 sessions max, why am I going to put points into that when I could put them into the stuff that I actually use? Um, I think that's a clever way
Yep.
to handle that sort of thing, is to be like, okay, well, here's the useful things and here's the non-useful things, and you just get some amount of the non-useful things without having to use up your limited resources that you want to use on the useful things.
Yeah. It's kind of like I think that's why Pulp Cthulhu. It's kind of cool the way it's like, okay, you're the ones you're using a lot are just going to get better on their own, naturally. So maybe you didn't put a lot of points in something, but if you wind up using it a lot, it is going to get better. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of corrects itself a little bit. Um,
Hmm.
one
Yeah, but
I
like I
you know
always, oh well,
Go ahead.
for Pulp Cthulhu games, I'm like, well, I always want to put like stuff into archaeology and history because those are things that I care about in real life and that I want games to care about those. And then I'm like, well, but I really should put those points into, you know, into my spot hidden, into whatever my combat skill is going to be, into my dodge skill, all of the things that I'm actually going to roll in the session, right? So, you
Hmm.
know,
Mhm. Mm.
All right. You know, one
Cool.
I
that's
was thinking about if we go. Oh,
no, no.
go
I
ahead,
was
Arlen.
just I just think that's kind of a classic game design element that I sort of run into, I guess. Right.
Yeah. Um, the uh, the one I'm thinking about, just to kind of shift gears a little bit, as we get more like kind of really popular rules. Like two that I like. I think these are more specific to D&D, but I think you could import them into other styles if you consider most games have at least some sort of class or archetype that fits the role of the warrior, the tough guy, the person who used weapons. Um, is shield shall be shattered. You know, the
Oh
ability to
yeah.
sacrifice a shield or a piece of armor to avert a damage or a critical hit.
Hmm.
And the other one that I really like from Dungeon Crawl Classics is the Mighty Deed of Arms for fighter types. It gives them that little bit of extra something they can do, um, particularly in a game maybe where it got a boring for the warrior type. You know, oh, I stabbed the guy, I punch the guy, I shoot the guy. Okay, well now I'll just kind of fade into the background while we're not in combat. You know, at least when I'm in combat, I can make it spicier
Yeah.
and pull off some pretty, some action hero kinds of maneuvers without having to. It's to me, it's a simple graft where you don't have to get into something complex like feats and feat trees and ability chains and things like that. Like you do, like some games do that on purpose, like 3E, 4E, 5E with feats that stack on one another, or like Marvel, where you've got your superpower and it branches and you kind of it
Yeah.
evolves over time. But that's just if you don't have something like that inherent in the game, it's just easy to say, here's something. Yeah, you're kind of a warrior type. Here's this extra. Just roll an extra die, and if it works out, then you get to trip somebody or swing from a chandelier, or you know.
Yeah, I think it's a cool. I think a few other games have kind of used a similar idea, right? So, Tales of Argosa, Low Fantasy Gaming. I'll say looking for group. Low Fantasy Gaming, um, the upcoming Reaver uses that, right? This idea, and then like even I mean, you can even say that a similar example will be like in Fantasy Age or the Age type of games that a double, even Cthulhu Age, a double will result in some sort of stunt or feat, right? So that again, it's just a table. Once again, um, just like it's a roll in DCC. So
Or
sets.
a momentum spend in a lot of the 2D20 games
Oh,
has
right.
something like that of change the scene basically,
Hmm.
um, or create a truth, whatever they call it, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I think it's always cool. I mean, part of it is that a lot of those old games, like you said, BJ, that the sword and board fighter type or the great sword fighter type or whatever fighter type you have that's basically a bag of hit points in a high or low armor class if you're using descending, um, just does not mechanically have that much interesting to do most turns compared to, right, because when you look at like a wizard, a mage of whatever sort, who is like picking out of the spell list of which thing they want to use for that turn, and they all have distinct special abilities and stuff. I think it's cool to have a way to allow a martial character to, change the situation, um, in a way that isn't just take down some of the hit points, especially when if you get into like for higher levels, a lot of the monsters become really big bags of hit points too. And because you're in this kind of binary state of, well, you and the monster either have hit points or are dead, that there's not, often without something like that, there's not a lot of way to like feel like you're contributing much to the situation aside from bringing us closer to the end of the race by doing damage.
Yeah.
And I always think that's fun to be like, yeah, I'm gonna, like I remember in first edition Love Fantasy Gaming, one of the examples is like, yeah, you want to like stab the monster in the eye so that it has a penalty to hit, right? And it's like, yeah, well, you do this procedure, and then you've done that, and you've changed the situation in a more meaningful way, and I think that's cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
One it's not on the fighter side, it's on the monster design side. When I I ran it at a fifth edition game, it would apply to any kind of, I think, game where you're fighting large monsters or large opponents that are far bigger than the characters, is to whether you use an armor class or defensive value, whatever it is you've got an aggregate, say AC, and if you hit that, and you take off the requisite amount of hit points, or you can target a specific part of the monster or whatever enemy is. It's a higher AC or there's a penalty, but not only does you do damage, but you affect whatever, if you hit it in the leg, that causes something with mobility. If you hit it in a wing, it can't fly anymore. So much so that you can even kind of map out, okay, if it has 100 hit points, 50 of them are on the torso and 10 are on this leg and 10 are on this, you can do that. And then once you've taken enough specific hits to a body part, it's not functional anymore.
Yep. That's interesting.
Um, so, but you could, the flip side is you could just give your warriors those mighty deeds and they could say, yeah, I want to stun it, kick it in the knee. It's hard enough that it it stumbles and now it's, crush its ankle and now it's dragging one leg behind it.
Yeah, that seems like an extra effect, though. I don't know. Is that what a mighty deed can do? I guess you could trip. You
I
can.
guess the mighty deed is not supposed to do damage. It's supposed to either let you perform some cool feat, but
Mm,
it can include like knocking people over, which then would probably give
yeah, help
the
out.
enemy has to waste some time riding itself, or the next person who can attack gets some kind of bonus or advantage on their attack.
Hmm. Yeah.
As that takes me to a rule that I think is really neat, and is useful in a very small percentage of games, but it's cool, I think, is that in the Margaret Weiss Publishing Marvel Heroic Role Playing game, one of the core things that you do when attacking an enemy potentially is not just like hit them to do damage with your powers or whatever else, overcome that sort of stuff. But one of the specific things that they have is basically to um, change the scene setup with regards to the characters, basically like knock a character through a wall so that they're not in that scene for right now. Um, and I always think that's such a flavorful rule for the way that comic book action feels, that one of like the core things that you do as the heroes or the villains is like figure out how to, like, Iron Man goes flying up out of the scene, and so he's like doing his own thing and he's still fighting, but he's not
Mm.
like actively contributing to the main fight. Or you have Hulk punch somebody through the wall, or any number of other. And I always think, oh, that's such a cool thing that I want in like basically all of my superhero games, is that like one of the things that matters is I'm going to, like, toss a character out a window on top of a skyscraper. It's like, well, they're not going to die because they're in a superhero game, but they are going to take a second to get back in and become involved in this again a lot. But you have, temporary negation instead of the
which is
sort of
exactly how
long term.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that's totally
which is
what comics
exactly how
feel like.
superhero battles happen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I remember that. I remember that from when I played it years ago, and I was like, yes, this is just like a comic book. Yeah, you knock him
yeah,
out the wall, and it's going to be so many minutes before he can return to the scene, or somebody goes with him, and now you're switching back and forth between the two areas or the two scenes, right?
yeah. But I think it's such a flavorful concept for superhero action to be like one of the core things that happens is, rather than, right, like in D&D, it makes sense that characters don't get like flung around that often. Like when you get hit by a sword, the force transfers in a way that is bad for your flesh, but doesn't send you flying normally, unless you're like in the prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring, and Sauron's using his big mace and smacking people around and stuff.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you don't have that type of like situational change, but that feels so like superhero-y to be like, yeah, you have, or you even have, right, like Superman, the whole Justice League is there and Superman flies down and just like tackles Darkseid and flies off with him while the rest of the Justice League is doing stuff. And that's like, oh,
Yeah.
that feels so much like the way that superhero fights are happening in other media, that is kind of hard to, right. Other games have some ways that they do that, right? Like Champions, and I guess Icons and Mutants Masterminds all have ways to be like, well, here's a rule for if you get hit hard enough, you go flying backwards. But I think that specific concept of like, yeah, one of the things that you do is like control who is actively taking part in the scene as much as doing things to characters in the scene is just a really fun, flavorful thing.
I I, I appreciate when a game, the mechanics of a game is not just generic role playing but with superpowers, or generic role playing but with handguns instead of swords. It's you find things that really tap into the genre, and I think yeah, that version of that the Margaret Weiss Marvel does a good job of that in a couple of fronts. I remember even the way they do initiative to me felt like this really sets us up for the way comic book works, because they use I think what's called popcorn initiative. It's like whoever wins goes first, or they can elect to pass, but they decide who goes after them. And so you can let an ally go next, so you're setting your buddy up for a combo, or you can let the enemy go next to kind of see what they're going to do. But that's you know that it's just like in a comic book where there's dialogue and action. It just seems like the way a comic book page gets laid out, the way it
Yep.
really works in practice.
Yep.
Well, we're coming up on about an hour, so it's probably a good
Good
point
time
to
to
wrap
stop.
it up.
Yeah.
Carl, either of you guys have any other rules you want to toss out there before we finish up?
No, I think that's good. We discussed a few. I'm sure others will come to mind, but I think those are the ones that I can feel that I've used recently, right? And or used regularly.
All right. Well, thank you guys for a good discussion. Uh, and thank everybody out there who's listening to this episode. And sooner or later, we'll be back with another discussion. It's just,
Right.
again, we're kind of sporadic. When the time is right and when we have a topic we can talk intelligibly on, we'll be back.
Yep.
So
All right.
until then, take care of yourselves out there.
Simple broadcast, cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the sign of Hemstraw. The all stars and pods past, cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Something is great, oh, escaping your brain, baby. What I mean is this machine's a freak, and from what I understand, now the Super is coming, and all that's left, crying and running. You can bring it, you can hide, you can bother in any order. Just another brain of legal tossers running for the border. Just a snap, like a one faster. Here and here, it's very splendid buzz. You can eat on a baby, and his customers never say it. It's a savor in the flavor of the movies it created.